Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Welcome, everyone, to the Michelle Meow Show at the Commonwealth Club of California. Thank you for being here, if you're here in the room, as well as everyone watching and listening online. For those of you who are here for the first time, or watching or listening online for the first time, the Commonwealth Club is how old are we? We're 118 years old. 118-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to civil discussion of important issues of the day. And frankly, finding workable art space in a city like San Francisco where no one can find space, I'd say that's an important issue. You can find all of our programs that are coming up, as well as video and audio of our past events at commonwealthclub.org. If you're in the auditorium, if you've got a cell phone with you, please put it on silent or vibrate. And we want to give a shout out of thanks to Cast SF and Counterpulse for the coffee and treats out there before the program. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Michelle Meow, the host and producer of The Michelle Meow Show, and a member of the Commonwealth Club Board of Governors. Michelle and our speakers, welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much for joining us for this very important and exciting discussion. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Hope you enjoyed the coffee and treats. Thank you, Cast SF and Counterpulse, for making this program happen. So let me introduce to you our speakers today. We have Moy Ng, who is the CEO of the Community Art Stabilization Trust here in San Francisco, and also Julie Phelps, who's the Artistic and Executive Director of Counterpulse. Let's give them a round of applause. So I always like to start off the program with a personal conversation because it's easier to talk to friends than it is to talk to strangers, and we're not. So let's open up with you, both of you, sharing your San Francisco story. And it could be anything. We've heard a range of stories from coming to the city, being born in the city, or an incident or a memory that you enjoy and love about San Francisco. Julie?
Yeah, well, we were talking about this actually in the dressing room because this is a really momentous occasion, which is why we're gathered here. And this year, we're about to buy our building. So there's been a lot of reflection actually on all the personal stories that have gone into making this happen. So during the talk, we'll talk about like the logistics and the brass tacks of how we made it possible. But a big dimension, the in between the lines dimensions, is the relationships and the stories. So I was remembering my first time meeting Moy, because when I first got involved in CAST was actually just in the really early stages, hadn't really been incorporated, wasn't yet an organization, and Moy Ng had not yet come onto my radar. So we had actually already gutted the building that we'll be talking about later today and had a kind of champagne toast to just sort of celebrate the groundbreaking. And that was the first time that I met Moy, and she had just moved into the executive director position at CAST, and we were underway, breaking ground, and it was one of my colleagues' birthdays that day, and Moy was like, if you don't mind, I'd like to sing happy birthday because the acoustics in the room are so incredible, because it was, totally empty. And just this operatic, beautiful, like bird song came out, and I just knew, I was like, this is gonna work. Yeah, but my San Francisco story really is the story that we'll be hearing today. I've basically grown up at Counterpulse. I started working there when I was 24 and have been able to see the organization through multiple transitions and, growing into further legacy, but also just growing in scale to today, really, where we're buying a building and putting down permanent roots in a city that I really love.
Woo, that is awesome. So huge. Boy.
I can't even follow up a story like that because I'm already in it.
I stole your story.
Yeah. No, not at all. It's a pretty wonderful story, and thank you, because it really it entwines both the personal and professional in a way that our lives have been so with Counterpulse and CAST. And I would say how I came to San Francisco is like many. I came because of a job. But I came because of a very super cool job. I was asked and said yes to coming to lead the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation's grant-making program. So I got this extraordinarily privileged view and possibility of really supporting the Bay Area arts ecosystem. And one of the things I learned was how prohibitively expensive space was here. And I was coming from Manhattan. And so it was stunning, and it was 2 surges ago. And so one of the things that I had the honor and responsibility of doing was identifying this as a critical issue during the 2000s. And thankfully, with the support of the board and the president and senior management at the time, we invested, when it was a we, $20 million to make happen 1 million square feet of new cultural space, permanent, in the Bay Area across 9 counties. So frankly, CAST is just the next chapter of that one thread that I've gotten the honor and responsibility of moving forward.
Wow, wow. Well, we're going to hear more about that moving forward process. But let's go back to before the partnership, before we actually got here today. I mean, throughout the 20 plus years that I've lived in the Bay Area, every year is kind of a heart attack because you go into that lease renewal process and then you're like, where am I going to be?
Yeah.
I can't imagine what that's like, you know, for a nonprofit, but let alone, you know, a nonprofit that services the arts. So Julie, take us all the way back. What was it like prior to the partnership? What was Counterpulse's situation?
Yeah, so at that time we were at 9th and Mission, and we moved into that building and got 50 cents on the square foot, and there was just holes in the ground and like derelict donut shops and mattress shops that were clearly a cover operation for something. And so we were there for 10 years, and the SOMA changed a lot during that time. Sort of at the pinnacle of that is when Twitter moved on to the Market Street side of our same block, becoming our neighbor. And at that point, we were 3 years from the end of our 10-year lease with our 50 cents a square foot, and we, you know, were not assuming we were going to be able to renew at that same price. So we started shopping around. We were also outgrowing that building. It was about 2/3 smaller than this facility that we're in now. And, you know, we did the things, we, you know, talked to consultants, we started doing strategic plans around what facilities would wrap around our services and what kind of debt service we could take on. All the kind of standard measures that, yes, most bring you to a heart attack more than to an inspiration point. But our story took a kind of sudden turn to the right when one of the consultants we were working with called me up one day and was like, you know, actually we have a building that could be a perfect fit for Counterpulse, and there's actually a way you could buy it. You know, and I don't know if it's just my outlook, but things that are too good to be true often are too good to be true, and I think this is the only example to the contrary of that I can express. And so we went and looked at this building, and they were like, actually, there's a foundation that wants to invest $5 million in stabilizing arts, you know, amidst that kind of like tech boom that was mounting. And it seems like this could be the kind of like puzzle that might all fit together, and we'd want you to be the program partner and take on this facility. And it was just like, my jaw is on the ground. I couldn't like believe it, and the building was perfect. And just, you know, we'd done the strategic plan. We knew what we wanted. It was the right square footage. It was right by a BART station. It was all the things that we needed. So it's sort of like the standard nonprofit story of, you know, getting priced out, displaced, and then suddenly just became an entirely different story. That's what we're telling today.
Mm-hmm. And so, Moy, perfect time for you. I mean, talk to us about what is the process? How did it all happen? What's the idea behind it?
CAST came about because, as I mentioned earlier, and you've already said it, and so has Julie, that living here is incredible and wonderful, and we want to stay here for lots of reasons, and one of them is arts and culture. However, we also happen to live in San Francisco Bay Area, which is one of the top 15 most expensive places to live in the world, and one of the top 3. So it makes it particularly challenging, unless you're very, very wealthy, of figuring out a way to live and work here. And for creatives and artists and arts organizations, it's even more of a challenge. And for CAST, we came about just on the lip of the last surge in the early 2010s to figure out with the founding board at the time and Julie, who came in very early on, as you just heard, when CAST was just a glimmer and an idea and an intention to figure out a way to perhaps hold on to some space in an affordable way. And so CAST came about in that way. And so that's our work.
But how does it work, I guess, for like people? Well, Julie said it, it just sounds too good to be true. And sometimes you ask, like, well, where's the money coming from? Or, yeah, like, how does it work?
Yeah.
Where's the money coming from? Is it?
Well, the money is actually coming from a lot of different places, which is one of the more fascinating parts about it. I mean, it's really interesting, Counterpulse's programming and the artistic side of what we do, but this has become an incredible part of our contribution to the field as well, is actually figuring out where does the money come for something like this. People care about it. People want to see arts and culture stay in spaces in city centers, but often people don't have the models. So there was $5 million of seed money invested by the Rainin Foundation. And that was really just out of their vision for just wanting to put their money where their mouth is on this problem we all know we're facing and is nothing new to anybody. And then that was able to be leveraged for additional funding at an upstart of CAST. And Moy could say more about that. But another major funding mechanism, which I find particularly exciting, is a federal New Markets tax credit, which is, like the Twitter getting the tax break on their payroll. You have to have a community benefit to qualify for these. And Counterpulse was actually the community benefit in this much larger tax credit deal that brought $1.3 million of federal money into the Tenderloin of San Francisco.
And that was in addition to about the 1.2 at the beginning, 1.3 that Counterpulse brought into it in terms of philanthropic dollars. We then found the rest of it through philanthropic dollars. And so that made the proverbial acquisition deal happen. And then over the last 7 years, Counterpulse has been using that time to go deeper into community, to expand its programs, to do, and I don't want to put words into Julie's. I've been the admirer and the partner from not that afar. And so we are now at the first window opportunity at the 7-year mark where the new market tax credits wind down and Counterpulse can state its intention to want to buy back the building and have a permanent home of its own. And that's what we're here to really talk about.
Yeah, and it's not complicated. It's really just somebody fronting the money to an arts organization that has its feet on the ground, but who could never participate in the space chase otherwise. And we've had 7 years now to get a running start. And that's all it's taken, really, like continuing to do our work, as Moy said, like really rooting and deepening our impact and, earning our building in a way, But yeah, it's poetic, just like it's simple in a way, but you have to find those people who want to make that first leap and make an investment of that scale in this city, and also take a risk on a nonprofit. But we were lucky enough to be able to make it happen.
By another nonprofit in partnership. And it's really what I think, whatever the details, and we will go in through some of the details, it's about patient capital, both leadership as well as straight up cash. How do we make this happen? What's the time? And how can we make this, through these mechanisms, structurally and financially, possible so that Counterpulse and other community arts organizations that are poised, who want and are ready to work towards a home, can do so?
And I ask this question really because there's lots of folks who join the conversation who are thinking, I want to make this happen as well, because the conversation around displacement isn't just here in San Francisco, and especially during COVID-19, and how COVID-19 or the pandemic affected the arts community. If we could, talk a little bit about that, and both of you share kind of what you're seeing, how the pandemic has made it harder or worse, maybe. Any of the data, like what's actually happening in the arts community right now?
Yeah, well, there's many things to talk about along that thread. As it relates to the future and other arts organizations having the opportunity to do what Counterpulse has done, one of the most brilliant dimensions of the partnership that we're in is that all the capital that Counterpulse raises to pay CAST back for the money they fronted to us is then, in the hands of a nonprofit real estate developer whose mission mandated to serve the arts and culture community. So it doesn't just go into the pockets of individuals or for-profit developers. It actually is then able to be invested into the next project. So I often, feel humbled to be able to do something that's so much bigger than myself, both in terms of setting the roots in the Tenderloin for Counterpulse and ensuring a permanent space for experimental arts, but also having raised this capital that will continually be recycled back into other people's real estate projects is just a huge honor. So it will gain momentum. We're the pilot project. We're the first one to complete the model, or we're almost completing the model.
We're this close. We're this close. This close.
This is set up to be, the dream of a frictionless machine where the capital that we work together to gather then continues to give back, the gift that keeps giving. In terms of how the pandemic has impacted it, I can tell a personal story about Counterpulse. As, we were 3 years out from the end of the 7-year unwind when the pandemic struck, and we were, intending to launch the final phase of our capital campaign then, and finish the acquisition of the building, and then instead we were boarding it up and canceling all of our programs, and I suddenly became a really bad TV producer, and we had to ask ourselves, should we be buying a building right now? Will people ever want to come be in small black box theaters with each other again? And we all remember those early pandemic days where it felt like it was not clear if we were ever going to find our way back to the path. And in a way we haven't, but it has been renewed that having space to create arts and culture is more important than ever. Artists need space that is safe for them to gather. In the early pandemic, just rooms that people could be distanced from each other, but in person and sharing practices and continuing to make and nurture their peer networks and things like that. So we just dumped a bunch of money into HVAC upgrades and just sort of, tally ho. So I think it is really important. I also think that virtual space has become an important part of the architecture of the arts and culture field, and I think we're really glad for that. We're finding new ways of reaching people that we'll stay committed to even while doubling down on, stewarding a facility. A lot of places have closed. It's been hard. Earned income just went off a cliff and hasn't really returned. Counterpulse is mostly operating through a philanthropic model, and we've actually been able to use the pandemic as a time to deepen those relationships. So we're stable right now, but that's not the story of all arts organizations for sure. Even just some of my peers, like Gray Area, they were running an earned income program in a way that I was envious of. And before the pandemic, I was like, oh, wow, I wish I had that kind of ticket sales, And actually, then that model really suffered, So I think, the story of the arts and culture field in every city that changes as quickly as San Francisco does is always one of resilience. We will always find a way because we're a creative community, we're resourced, we're diverse. But it has been a struggle. Wouldn't lie about that.
I'll just echo what Julia said so eloquently. For CAST, we double down. Our focus is on finding solutions in partnership with artists and creatives and arts organizations to really look at long-term and permanent solutions to acquiring and stewarding space. So we doubled down on that we're always going to need space. It may look different, but we will. Secondly, what we did was also had to respond to our colleagues and partners in Oakland and in San Francisco. And in particular, the Oakland example is we created a new venture called Dreaming Spaces. And it was really prompted by artists and cultural leaders in Oakland saying, we have venues, we have to close them. What do we do? How do we use our spaces? What about other spaces that are more open or outdoor? How do we gather safely again? So we came up with this initiative to really work with our partners in Oakland, in this case, because that's where we were at the time, and when the pandemic really broke and venues were closing up because they had to, and we were in shelter in place. And it's hard to just go back to that. And so we started looking at questions with public health officials, design leaders, and artists to say, what could we do? How do we think about this problem, and how do we utilize space and gather safely within a new pandemic environment?
Could you talk a little bit more about, the venues that have closed and in a real effort to either revive the venues or get people back into those venues? Do you have any information at all about some of the artists or artist groups or organizations that may have been forced to leave and want to come back, and what efforts look like in helping people come back?
I think that's a really great ecosystem question. And what I would just say is that one thing and I'll just do a contrast and compare, that governments, or I should say, countries like England and Europe, where there's a principal governmental model, and much of the funding goes through that, and private sector funding less so, just percentage-wise, that one of the things that one can do is really look at surveying, collecting information, because it's coming through all of the support. That is much more decentralized in San Francisco and in the US. So collecting information on the broader ecosystem is much more around our web of networks, and that's our relationships, and it's actually mostly anecdotal. The last sense of surveys, which gave us some sense, real sense of factoids of what was going on, was in 2015 and 2016, where we had 3 surveys, one conducted by San Francisco Arts Commission that said, what's going on? Why are you leaving? Are you staying? What do you need? The space assessment, and it was sobering. And none of it is a surprise to us now as we look back, and it feels ancient, but nevertheless, I think it's still relevant. 60%, roughly, if I'm remembering correctly, of the artists that responded were saying they were looking at being evicted or looking at space instability within 6 months to a year. And it was probably higher.
Yeah. I remember working with a nonprofit organization, and I mean, I think around 2015, 2016, it was just a question of, well, we might not have our own space, but maybe we could shack up with, a few other organizations. What's a process like when you're working with the building owners or the any open spaces? And then you start talking about like the partnerships. And so maybe Julie, specifically talking about Counterpulse and getting to this place, like do you go in there and do you offer like, hey, we have money, we're gonna buy this building, so.
Yeah, the story of acquiring 80 Turk Street is actually quite interesting. And it was a building that had been sitting vacant for at least a decade. It had been built in a cabaret in 1902. Sort of went on an arc towards porn cinema over the many decades that intervened, and then boarded up and sat empty from the early 90s on, like so much of the lower Tenderloin. So the person who owned the building, more just like case in point than being able to maybe summarize, because I actually think it's quite unique. Like each building owner is different, is it part of their family wealth? Like this particular owner, for example, had a kind of just love affair with board-poured concrete buildings, and so had bought up a bunch of those in the kind of like .com boom or bust, I guess. And then just was kind of sitting on them. There was like filing cabinets being stored in the cinema portion of this building the first time I saw it, just like really, really vacant. And first, it's at every point, one thing that we talk about, at every point of the project, there needs to be a kind of philanthropic spirit around that inspires bringing the cost down, right? Because yes, this is a model for playing in the real estate market, but it's not a model for just like participating in just like the wild, like, overpriced, like everything going over asking, speculative market. It's also about like interrupting that energetically. So the relationship was built with this person over the course of certainly a number of years. It was related to some of these space surveys that Moy was talking about and identifying vacant square footage in the mid-market district when that was a kind of priority of the city. And this building was identified, and it had some, gems when it comes to developing. It was already zoned for assembly, so there was no change of use. And these sorts of lubrications were really important to the whole project adding up. And one of those things was that the owner was friendly, had always just sort of wanted to see it remain a theater instead of get torn down and turned into like a 4-story condo building or something like that. And was actually really suspicious of us at first. I think we were both having the like too good to be true feeling. And there was a cash offer on the building because this foundation had put in the $5 million to move and close on a building. And he sat on that cash offer forever, and then it wasn't until he finally actually came to our location at 9th and Mission and experienced a theater show and was like, "So you really are like a theater group, huh?" And I'm like, "I'm trying to tell you this," And so then he signed the cash offer that day, and it itself was a sort of philanthropic deal. Like, he sold it to us for 1.3. It's 10,000 square feet, half a block from the Powell Street BART station. So that's sort of like what really got the whole thing moving, right? So effectively, the New Markets tax credit, it's a coincidence actually, also was 1.3, and it's sort of like, poof, it like didn't happen or something, which is, it's really incredible. I actually don't know what the appraisal of the building would be right now because it's so purpose-built and, has so much very sophisticated technical equipment now that as a shell, I think it would be a really different question than what it really is as a purpose-built sort of cockpit for arts that, it serves Counterpulse's purposes quite well. So, I mean, I think that, the networks, the weaving, the tapestry, the relationships, I think it really starts there. Like, there's a lot of people in this town who do actually care about San Francisco being cool and, like, not just a bunch of, like, shiny bars, And giving them a viable opportunity to enact that value is what we've done. Like,
Exactly.
Once the good news is there, like the owner's like, oh my God, this is actually a theater group who's gonna I'm gonna sell this building too cheap and who's then gonna like keep San Francisco cool. Like, there's a lot of people who wanna see that happen. So if you build the relationships and find those affinity lines, a lot becomes possible even in what seems like these impossible conditions of the speculative real estate market.
And I just want to add to what you've already said, Julie, is that especially in your story and your point with the owner of the building, who didn't quite believe you. You both looked at each other suspiciously and sort of like, this is really great, and this is what I wanted, but are you who you are? Mm-hmm. And then there's money. There's really cash down, and we're ready to go. So it goes back to, well, how does CAST work, and how does CAST work with Counterpulse? We work at the speed of trust. And I think that a lot of these relationships that go cross public and private sector, working with the city, with the mayor's office, OEWD, San Francisco Arts Commission, Grants for the Arts, the planning department, and that's only just a few, Park and Rec, they're wherever we all touch with a particular program and an organization and the particular project. So there's that part of it. So we need leadership around this. Then there's the foundations, cultural planners. How could we do this without artists? Because at the end of the day, artists and cultural organizations are at the center of this, and that's who really drives it. And getting back to the discount, in the dialect of venture capital, everything needs to be at a discount. Mm-hmm. Somewhere along the way at key points, it's either that or philanthropic. And in this case, there was a philanthropic intent by the owner, and there was philanthropic dollars. Then there was public sector dollars with the New Market tax credit. There was more philanthropic support, both to Counterpulse and to CAST, to make the acquisition happen, as well as the construction. And now at the back end, that's what we're looking at as well. And it's all for the long-term view of holding and stewarding a space that will be a permanent cultural asset to the community.
My mind is so blown. Yes, yeah, it's the truth, about like people in San Francisco that still really, really care. I mean, the city would not be the city without its arts and artists and this culture that we've built, that the world knows about. So, Julie, today, we're at this point now with the buyback. I mean, what does that mean to you and to Counterpulse and to a ton of artists who love the city as well?
Yeah. So, Counterpulse has actually always been blessed to have relatively stable space and be endowed with just space to work in. We were founded in essentially what was an oversized living room on Divisadero Street by a collective of artists who started just producing shows and inviting their friends, which then became a community, to just do really just like low overhead, just sharings. But it's like, it shows you what space can do. What is otherwise just a group of friends becomes the founding collective of an art space that's now 30 years old because they had a really big living room, right? It's like space is actually this ingredient, right? That's really important. So, we had that, and that was an incredible opportunity. Finding the, affordable space in the Soma was an incredible opportunity, and then moving into this. So in a way, it's actually what's really radical about it is its continuance. It's like going to change things for Counterpulse to feel that we own it outright, and I think that there'll be different energetics around that, and also just being able to move on to other dimensions of our work and community, deepening our impact, broadening our reach, these kinds of things, like, just having the asset. But yeah, I think in a way, it's the way I've been thinking about it is what's really incredible about this for Counterpulse is that it's actually allowed us to not have to change. For us to just be able to continue our work and not all of a sudden need to expand our earned income programs so that we can pay for the way more expensive lease or whatnot, So I think there'll be a huge celebration and a sense of sovereignty and permanence that will come with buying this building and putting the roots down and knowing that it's deed restricted, and that's because it's been such a pet project of mine, and I've definitely been maybe very protective of it. But then once the building is bought and the deed restriction is in place, it's just going to feel like all this work that all these people who've really cared about this building being for the arts then just gets planted in the ground as a seed. Like, there's nothing that can happen to it. It will be for arts and culture, even if Julie Phelps gets hit by a bus and Counterpulse dissolves.
We don't want that to happen.
I know. My staff is like, you really honestly just need to stop saying that. Yeah, see, we need to get some wood
That's
on
only
the
because we
stage.
both say it, and I just don't say that anymore.
So that'll be a part of it, I think. Both being able to stay the same, and then also just the energetic click of I actually grew up at Counterpulse, like I said, right? So I've actually I've never owned a home, and I'm really starting to wrap my head around what an asset really is. I'm a strong manager. I can manage a budget down to the penny if you ask me to. And I know how to work with cash, and this has been a real learning curve over the last 7 years of being now there's this whole other thing in play that is a resource that, can be leveraged to do all sorts of things, and just kind of actually just that being on a discovery path and partnering with the artist to discover that, what can this building do for us? What can this building be when there's no one to tell us no? We could be it's just gonna tear this wall down. We could really do whatever we want, and that's just its own incredible asset to owning your building, much less the permanence, Yeah.
Yeah, that's all really exciting. By the way, I think you just sold yourself to every single nonprofit there is out there. Understands cash, make money.
You need a penny managed. I'll give you my business card.
No, but I was going to ask about the budget, and it's kind of a geeky question, but I am curious to know. I mean, where you got all this freedom now, and if you were looking at even 5 years, 10 years from now, in terms of the opportunities that if something new, something different that you might be able to do now because you're not worried about, right? Redesigning the budget to include 30% markup on a new lease or something like that.
Yeah.
I haven't thought that far. You're probably just, hey, we're just ready for the buyback now.
Yeah, I'm literally does the future exist after July? No. I think the biggest growth pattern that Counterpulse has been on is one of a deepening path, which is a kind of strange way to grow, and that it's especially in amidst the tech boom in Silicon Valley and scaling up, and I think that will really be the difference. I spend a lot of time and have spent a lot of time raising this money. Just the actual task of raising money takes time. And I look forward just for myself to just more contemplative, long timeline research projects that, culminate in a slower rhythm than just always hustling on the project timeline, And I think that could be true of the community at large, of just feeling there's a general churn that comes with being a nonprofit, a lot of project-based funding. You don't know that you have the money until you already need to be spending it. You're kind of on the hamster wheel of the sort of nonprofit model. And I think that I've always been interested in sophisticating that model, in some ways dismantling it, but just finding a way to slow down, especially coming out of the pandemic. And I think, at least for me and a lot of the people around me, just learning that slowing down is a really incredible opportunity, actually, not just a burden. And I think that just like, yeah, like knowing that you can project forward like 10, 20 years and that there aren't these huge variables that you have no control over that you can't plan for, like how much is your lease payment going to be? And then therefore, what does my business model be? And how many staff members can I have? Like, I think you can just like really just like slow down the pace of certain types of planning and actually plan. I mean, just frankly, plan things. Like it's hard to plan things when you're just like hustling on not knowing the outcome of really important parts of what you do.
Anything to add, Moy?
That what I've just heard is what you're living. I mean, there's not much more I could add other than you're the first. You got the dubious honor of pioneering. Thank you. And to see what happens whether it's our personal home or our professional home, what it does is a level of freedom, and especially in a really heated and sometimes overly heated market. So that's what I'm hearing, and to get to that place where you actually can imagine it, a life that's slightly different, and then what has already been said, and again, I'm not going to say it as eloquently as Julie, is to be able to have the space to not have thinking about, for instance, a 30 to 35% markup on negotiating another lease that's 3 to 5 years, and hopefully you have a good landlord, and how do I reshape my business model so that I can still support my mission and what I envision for this theater that's really about invention and reinvention and provocative theater and dance and performing arts, and that requires risk capital and a space to be able to do that. And when you have a structural model, when you're in an overheated market, to free yourself of that to some degree is extraordinary, and what we hope our work does in partnership.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing to consider space as risk capital, because I think we think of risk capital as this like fast cash for like making, but it does feel like the building itself is a type of risk capital, you know?
Yeah.
Can we go back to what you said? If I heard correctly, you did say that, CAST doubled down during the pandemic to try to help as much as possible. If you could, did I hear it correctly? Yeah.
What we did was two things. One is we doubled down on our mission and our strategies, which is working with artists and creatives and organizations. And this work is, you're hearing, we're all hearing, it takes years. And we're hearing the piece that's post-acquisition towards raising the money to have a permanent home. So the relationships, the capacity building, the needs assessment, the fundraising, it takes years, all while, for an arts partner, doing their work. So we continue to do, as I've mentioned in the past, I made a life professionally of working in the invisible, and that's really about the infrastructure. And every so often, I get to talk and move the invisible to the visible. So what we're doing is just moving and talking about the work that we're doing behind the scenes to make a home happen for Counterpulse and all of the elements that go with it. And so what CAST did is continue our invisible work, because oftentimes, for instance, when you're negotiating a deal, the owner does not want to be public. You're in the middle of a negotiation. You want to, if it goes public, they're going to say, well, I want a market value, the 10 millions when my ship comes in, and there's a possibility and a delicacy around a deal negotiation that may need to be quiet for the benefit of the organization, in this case, Counterpulse, and I'm not just saying that's what happened, and for a larger ecosystem of seeing Counterpulse dive in even more in its roots. So there's a delicacy and a quiet. And going back to the invisible, is that at this moment, it's just, we double down on the long-term work with our current as well as new organizations and creative entrepreneurs, as well as startups. So we did that. and on Dreaming Spaces, which was our more initial response. We've done this before in 2015, 2016, when displacement was on the lips and loudly on everyone. What are we going to do? We have to leave. Rents are going up. It's post-Twitter. So we, with then NCCLF, now Community Vision, we together were awarded a $2 million grant that we moved out into the community to address displacement. We were not planning on being a grant maker, but again, we have the skill sets, and it was really in response to serve the community, and because we could.
Yeah, it's just so heartwarming to hear that, especially because, you know, during the pandemic, we were so scared. There was a lot happening, uncertainty, and I don't know, you know, if Julie, you want to add what was that whole thing like, if you thought that the deal was going to fall through, or I don't know. My mind went to the worst. And then I was hearing from all my artist friends who, you know, were out of work, not sure where they were going to end up professionally and personally. So the follow-up question, even to your statement of saying double down, was just like, I find I'm just so emotional about the part that people care. You found that people care, that even through uncertainty and a pandemic, that they're willing to say, let's continue the work, let's do more, right?
The answer is yes.
Yeah.
I'm a hardcore, long-term lover, appreciator, and long-term cultural worker. I've been doing this work personally and professionally. I've just paid forward what I got in my childhood. So I've been doing this work for 40 years. So I've seen ebbs and flows in two of the super cities, New York and San Francisco Bay Area. So the issues that we face, we're seeing an incredible moment because of the pandemic. We see the ebbs and flows of when real estate is super expensive to really expensive to back to just sort of expensive. I know, that's the baseline.
Ebbs and flows.
However, and I know everybody in the room's from the Bay Area and living here, so you know exactly what we're talking about in terms of the baseline. So there's a long-term, this issue's not going to go away. We need space. I mean, if we're going to stay in the arts and support the arts and culture, we need space, we need money resources, and we need leadership. And there is really political will, and I mean political in the community, as you've just heard so beautifully from Julie, that people care so much because they just want to know, how can we have a role in this? And so it takes indeed a village.
Yeah, and it does. It's the model is really important because there's so often this sense of helplessness when it comes to real estate and displacement, and the idea that Counterpulse is sort of staking is, okay, we're buying a building, but we're also staking an idea, which is that it can be done. Like, people can donate to something and we'll amalgamate it all together and make a quilt and make something out of this, and we can work in real estate. We can surmount this problem, and we have an example now. And the name of the program is very apt, Dreaming Spaces, because I often talk about this as a sort of like dream that's coming true or something like that. And that's a really important part of it, is that the will and desire to do something can then actually meet with a solution that actually can be followed through on and be realized. And that's, you know, there's people who've given to Counterpulse's capital campaign who've given $500. And that's the single largest philanthropic gift they've ever given. And it matters to them that they're helping address this thing that's been kind of like a dragon in their lives up until that point, like just displacement and real estate and the helplessness of that. And they're like, oh, actually, like, we can overcome. It's really powerful, and it's an immense privilege to have been working with people investing in this, because it's just been a really inspiring story of individuals getting inspired to actually live up to their own values, you know? So yeah, it's definitely the model we're offering into the world is hopefully just going to cascade into just many more stories like this, and we won't even be having this conversation anymore. I've actually kind of almost trained out the doomsday thinking of like displacement and this and that, because I just all of a sudden started realizing I have to start telling a different story because I actually have a different story, and not many other people have a different story than that. So I like weeded out the word displacement of all of Counter Pulse's capital materials and things like that. You know, I'm like, we need to make the other story, you know?
Yeah, I'll tell you, it's so inspirational. I'm still in disbelief. Like, I'm like, this is really happening. This is, yeah, and it'll go down in history. And this is a story that can be shared many times over and over and over in this right now future. So the question is, do you think that, or I guess explain how you might feel that this could save the arts? Like we have this conversation in this city.
We left our capes on the East Coast. Really?
Well, because there's this ongoing conversation of how the arts was not necessarily prioritized in terms of support and funding, especially during COVID-19. We all had to like rally together and do it for our community, but where was the support from, you know, wherever? But maybe those were just microscopic conversations.
Julie, do you mind if I take a stab at this?
Yeah.
And it really sort of echoes or piggybacks on the question, or actually the issue of possibility. One of the things I've always felt when I moved here from New York, the place of four seasons, and coming here and it feels like spring all the time, which is usually a sense of possibility and new beginnings, that it always feels like spring. And the very fact that Silicon Valley is here and new things, new inventions, and a counterpulse exists. So what CAST brings is effectively, in partnership with Counterpulse, an idea, a model, a living model of how it can be possible. And one thing I want to also pull up is the deed restriction, because super technocrat kind of thing, but for the geek in us, the deed restriction is the postscript, but the lovely postscript that in that restriction, that means that if Counterpulse says, you know what, we're blowing up out of the building. In fact, we need another building twice as big. She didn't say this to me, I'm just making this up. And it's so fabulous. I know I don't want to do another capital campaign. That's the Julie channeling. However, I think the building's just too small. And we want to stay in the Tenderloin, we want to stay in mid-market, but the building's too small. The deed restriction says that Counterpulse can only sell it to another organization that does principally arts and culture. Wow. So it remains a permanent asset. On the thing of possibility, I think you remember at the top of this that we were talking about that we're one of 15 of the most expensive cities. Hong Kong takes that. We're usually 8 to 10. We're top 3 in the US. Dubious honor, really hard. We have been since our beginning when we were just really an organizational baby in the mid-2015, 2016. Other cities have looked at us and said, they're working on permanent solutions. We're having the same problem. What should we be doing? And we're not saying we're the silver bullet. We're saying that we're a living laboratory to see if we can deal with these issues in a creative and inventive way. And Counterpulse and our partnership's the first out. So cities like Hong Kong, Sydney, London, Paris, Tel Aviv, Vancouver, Chicago, and more have reached out to us and said, so what are you doing there? And we have become cited as a model, including in a non-arts publication, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. So I think that it gets back to, it's lovely, is that this is a potential beta test and a model for possibility and hope that we can do something about it.
Yeah, and exactly. It's actually San Francisco's responsibility to, because we've spent many decades and across many sectors cultivating this perpetual spring of opportunity and innovative ideas, that people are ready in San Francisco to invest in an untried idea. That first $1 million was not easy for Counterpulse to raise, right? The too good to be true kind of preceded the ask, you know? But it happened. Actually, people do take leaps in this town, and it feels like we owe it to the world to have prototyped this here. Like, I was just on a call with bankers this morning exploring some like bridge loans for like, you know, cash flow around the transaction, right? Like just very mundane conversation. And they were, you know, they were inspired. They were like, wow, this is really exciting, you know, and they're technocrats to the extreme, actually, but really ready to say yes to it and find a way, you know, a financing product that works for this thing that they've never even heard of before. And that spirit in the Bay Area, I think, is one of the kind of underwriting successes of this project.
I was going to add also an example of equity. There's so many people talk about equity, but actually maybe use it more like a buzzword than really understand what equity is. And I think that this is a great example. Moy, I think you were going to say something?
No, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. We're winding down on time. We got, you know, last 5 minutes or so, and wanted to have you give your final thoughts on, you know, the sharing your story here. And again, we already kind of talked about the future of the arts and sustaining, you know, space for the arts, but it's an interesting time for so many of us. We're starting to go out there in the world. We're here. We don't know what the future is going to be. It feels like sometimes we're taking 2 steps back, 1 step forward. And so if you could leave us with your final thoughts on where do you, the arts.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the provocation of equity is a really good one to close on, and you know, it goes back to a little bit of talking about the asset, right? That we're building equity, right, in a very concrete, literally poured concrete way in the Tenderloin, and that's really important to endow communities with equity. But it's also a way to navigate change, you know, like the cities like San Francisco, and maybe all cities and maybe all things, they do change, right? It's going to change, and the difference between an equitable change and an unfair change is just who gets to be involved in the conversation, who has resources to participate in meaningful ways, you know? And Counterpulse is sort of modifying the answer to that question, you know? We are a property owner in our neighborhood, which, creates a different power dynamic when I show up at a police commission meeting or when I go to public comment at City Hall or something like that. When I talk to my neighboring business partners who are running, their business and what it means for us to be leaders in the community, and that then the community listening and rootedness that Counterpulse has like a transference point to be operating at a different level than, just the programming that we do, but we can consolidate a community response from the stakeholders that we represent. And then we actually have just redesigned and re-engineered some ways that the arts can be involved in neighborhood and community development. And that's really important because, San Francisco needs some answers to that question. I think we've all seen a lot of neighborhoods change in ways that, feel bland and like a lot of really important things were lost. I mean, the Stud closed during the early pandemic, I think we need to find ways for different people to participate in how the city is going to change. And this is also a model for that.
I'm never going to follow you at any panel ever again.
You're too sweet.
I did leave my cape on the East Coast. I would only add, and I'll kick the conversation a little up more, and stay within space. As we look at equity, it's my dream, vision, and what I've worked for, no matter what my title has been over the last 4 decades, is to really look at moving capital, leadership, and supporting what this America looks like and what this San Francisco Bay Area feels like and is manifested, And so as I bring it back to CAST, and I'll just say the full name because it's not a misnomer, Community Arts Stabilization Trust, that I'm hoping that we can do more models like a Counterpulse, because nobody is like Counterpulse, in the sense of creating a larger fund for investment with partners that are rooted in community, that have strong financials, that really want and need an envelope, a space, so that they're able to, whether they are traditional culture bearers, to reinventing forms that I can't even speak of because it's really new, that there is a space for them, a physical space to share that. And we need more of that. And it will take more resources in addition to leadership. So that's all I have to add to that.
Very quickly, and last question, I promise. But Julie, tell us what's coming up at Counterpulse so we can end with something exciting, something to look forward to.
Yeah, it is exciting. It's the first season we've planned to be completely in person since the pandemic, and it's also exciting that it hasn't been completely in person already, but there's a spring brochure actually in the lobby, and you can check it out at counterpulse.org. We have some more conversations like this related to Counterpulse's role in the community to build awareness and understanding of our acquisition. So if discourse events are a preference, there are a few more, one coming up on the 7th with Gary Camilla to talk about the Tenderloin specifically and the sort of cultural asset that it is to the city of San Francisco. And also one at the end of April, I believe on the 30th, looking at the nightlife economy and Counterpulse's sort of like interloping and support with that community. We also have a slate of performances. Our annual gala, and we call it an art party and auction, is on May 7th. So that's a really fun day to come out because it's sort of a, what would you say, a whole work sample of Counterpulse. If you come to Counterpulse any day of the year, you might get a really different experience. That's one of the exciting things. The only one thing we do is no one thing. And this one event sort of brings all those threads together so you can, participate in a drumming circle, see a visual art opening. We're unveiling a lighting sculpture on the front of the building. There'll be dance performances. And you can kind of like find your way into something that interests you at Counterpulse through that event. So yeah, please take a brochure, check us out online.
And then Moy, if someone, I'm sure of it, there's going to be a lot of people and want to get in touch with you and save me too.
Okay, I'll have our collective cape moved back from the East Coast. So if you're interested and would like to be in touch with us, please reach out to us on our website at cast-sf, like San Francisco.org. I really look forward to seeing all of you in the audience and to hearing more questions. And you should talk to Julie some more.
Yeah, I'm about to make you the most eligible bachelor on town. Moy joked with me when we first met. We're getting married, and the good thing about it is that we know we're going to get divorced in 7 years.
We're gonna have the truly American marriage. In 7 years, we're gonna have an amicable divorce, and you will get the house.
Deal. I was like, okay, deal.
God, I've never heard a professional relationship spoken like that before.
It's been a joy and honor to be on stage and in conversation with both of you. This is an incredible story coming out of the pandemic, and it's so exciting. So thank you to the work that you all do. Thank you to our community. There's so much love here, and it certainly makes the future full of optimism. So thank you. Thank you to all of you for joining us today at the Commonwealth Club. Thank you to all of you who are joining us online. For more information and all of our programming, you can head to commonwealthclub.org, or for specific Michelle Meow show programs, you can head to commonwealthclub.org/MMS. Thanks again to CAST SF and to Counterpulse and all the delicious coffee from Fluid and cookies from Crumble and Whisk. Yeah, so let's go enjoy some and stick around for just a little bit to hang out. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Michelle.